And so as we kind of saw graphically, the parallel shift of the budget constraint after the kind of pivot to change the relative prices is just an increase in M. So we've kind of seen that before, right? It's if we increased M in, back in chapter 2 or whatever it was, as we shifted the budget straight, this parallel shift out was a change in income. And so that's why it's called the income effect. And we're kind of holding prices constant as we do it. So this is called, hence, the income effect. And so kind of mathematically, what we're doing is the change in x1, and now the notation is going to be an n for income effect, of course, equals the change in consumption when we have the new prices and the original income minus what the demand function looked like at the new prices with the compensated income. So we saw this in chapter 6. And we drew the relationship between kind of income and the quantity demanded of these goods through the income offer curve or the angle curve, right? So we saw in chapter 6 that this could be positive or negative. Depending on type of good. I think this is still on the screen. So, if we have a normal good, as income goes up, quantity demand goes up. Whereas we have inferior goods, as income goes up, quantity demand goes down. And like vice versa. So if we have a normal good and income goes down, the quantity demand goes down, for instance. And so let's kind of use the example that we've been using as we've kind of gone through this chapter. Again, it might be obvious what the income effect is, since it's just the total effect minus the substitution effect, but let's kind of calculate it directly using that example we saw. So before we calculated the total effect. We calculated the demand at the new prices and old income, and that was equal to x1. Remember, the new price was 2 and the original income was 120. We also calculated the demand when we had the new price and the adjusted income. Remember, we figured out how much we need to adjust it, and then we calculated that when we calculated the substitution effect. And this is whatever the demand for good 1 is at a price of 2 and an income of 106. Remember, we had to adjust income down 14 to hold purchasing power constant. We knew that with our demand function, this was 16. We calculated this being 15.3. And so the income effect delta x1n equals x1 p1 prime m minus x1 p1 prime m prime equals 16 minus 15.3 equals 0.7. And again, that kind of makes sense, right? Because the total effect was 2. We already calculated the substitution effect, which was 1.3. So it's kind of left over. It's got to be the income effect, 0.7. But we can kind of confirm this, and hopefully that helps you kind of understand the functions that we're working with. So the direction of this effect depends on whether the good is normal or inferior. So it could be positive if normal. I mean, it depends how you want to express it, right? Like, so if income goes up and we purchase more of this good, then it's going to be normal. So maybe I should write it out that way. That's a normal good. So if this effect is positive, and we have, if this effect is positive, we have a normal good. And if m goes, if m goes up and x1 decreases, that's an inferior good. So it kind of depends how you're adjusting income in terms of kind of figuring out whether it's one way or another to kind of classify as a normal or inferior good. Now, I've kind of hinted at this before, but the substitution effect, we're always going to substitute away from a good that became more expensive. So let's kind of erase this and talk about why. So the income effect could go either way. It could be positive, it could be negative. Again, it kind of depends how you frame it as well. But the substitution effect is always going to be one direction. It's always in the opposite. Is always the opposite. It's always the opposite to the change in price. For instance, if the price of good one went up, this would mean a decrease in x1 due to the sub effect. The total effect is going to depend on the income effect as well, right? And if the price of good one decreases, then we're going to have an increase in x1, again, due to the sub effect. And kind of the logic looks something like this. So let's say here is x2, and here is x1. Let's have the original budget constraint and the original choice. Let's label that A. We'll be calling it x1 star. And then what's happening is, until these colors show up, remember we had this price change, and we've been kind of concentrating on a decrease in price, so it pivots out. And then to draw these two effects, I'm just going to grab another color here. We've been shifting, we've been reducing this money income in to hold purchasing power constant. So something like that, right? And again, it's going to cut right through this point A as well. Now, let's kind of logically think our way through this. Well, we're picking A over any other bundle to the left of A along this kind of original, I don't know if it shows up as pink to you or what shows up on your screen, but for this original budget line. So we are picking A above anything to the left of this original budget line, which means when we adjusted income and adjusted prices, we're not going to pick anything to the left of A along this kind of greenish budget line. So the worst that's going to happen, the worst that's going to happen is that we're going to stay at A. And there's going to be kind of no substitution effect. Otherwise, we're definitely going to be to the right of A when we're figuring out our substitution effect. So this is why the substitution effect is always going to go in the opposite direction of the price change. Because we're never going to consume anything to the left of point A. Maybe point A again, if there is no substitution effect. Otherwise, if we're going to draw that point C, it's going to be somewhere to the right of A. And again, like I'm saying, like if we were drawing that point C, like in terms of the sub effect, in terms of like the point that we're trying to calculate it. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so let's kind of bring these two effects together and kind of talk about the change in total demand.